Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Bowden, the product marketing lead for intelligent utilization management here at Availity. And with me today is Lydia Turner, senior strategy consultant at PwC. Lydia is going to expand a bit on some of the topics we introduced in our Reclaiming Utilization Management webinar. And we just can't wait to hear from her. Lydia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be back to talk about this topic some more.
Lydia, earlier you talked about governance as more than just a structure. You described it as a virtuous cycle of evaluation and feedback where clinical leaders, operations, and analytics all share ownership of performance. Let's build on that idea real quick, because once that governance model is in place, the real differentiator becomes how effectively a health plan can use their data to adjust operations. Can you share a few examples of where a payer has analyzed its data and was able to adjust operations quickly, and how that speed itself became a market differentiator?
Yeah, absolutely. So you just said it perfectly. When governance is working, you don't have to wait to be reactive to complaints or cost overruns that come from claims 3 months later. The data itself tells you when and where to act. And the differentiator is being able to recognize the signal early and having the structure in place to respond in weeks, not quarters. So I've got 3 examples for you of how we've seen payer clients use their data to react more quickly. So the first one, the signal was simple. The administrative costs of reviews and services had started to approach the savings that it was generating. When we net ROI, it had below this payer's internal threshold and what we sort of understand to be industry benchmark for ROI. So we're having a financial sort of indicator here. Signals that you see in the data that may be similar to this or indicate this would be admin costs per review increasing, denial rates potentially dropping, appeal overturn rates rising, and overall net savings per review falling below threshold. So the signals are there. The action that this payer took was to evaluate individual codes and service categories for specific areas that were driving down ROI that needed adjustment. So we dug into that, and really the operational change that followed pretty quickly was shifting some services from a full MD review to a Sentinel or an auto approval, and also increasing the dollar and utilization thresholds for some of the reviews. This allowed for, overall our reduced provider abrasion and member abrasion, which are always goals in really reallocating our nurses and MD capacity to those higher risk services, and also maintaining just overall lower friction in the system. So, again, competitors at this point were still debating policy and quarterly commitments, whereas this payer was able to adjust within a month, in position to be more provider friendly and make sure that they were driving to financial value actually coming out of their operation. So that's one example of where we saw a signal in the data and were able to respond quickly and make adjustments. The second example I have for you is really wasn't a financial one, it was an operational disruption. So in this case, over about a 2-week period, we started to see that cases per reviewer per day were dropping, and they'd actually dropped nearly 20%. So the number of cases that reviewers were getting through a day had started to slow down. Signals in the data specifically came from cases per day declining. We also saw turnaround time starting to tick up, right? We're not getting through the same number of cases and the rate that we need to. And we started also seeing, unsurprisingly, aging in our queues. So the backlog of cases started to grow. The average age of cases started to increase past, even past internal SLAs. So those were the indicators about to go look at something. And what we did here was, instead of really changing policy, we started to dig into the workflow. So in this case, we dug into the end-to-end workflow and did what we kind of call time and motion studies, started to understand the time it takes to complete each step and see where there is variation. What we identified was that there was some ping-ponging between the provider and the team, and that was causing some delays for a handful of cases. We also found some inconsistent application of criteria that was creating unnecessary medical director review, given their sort of confusion in the process there. And we also identified some routing rules that were over-triggering manual review, where we weren't getting the benefit of auto approval or Sentinel authorization or any other automation in the process. The rules weren't really allowing for the workflow to follow the way it was supposed to be. So the indicator was reduced cases per day. We dug into the process to really hone in on where the inefficiencies were coming from. And ultimately, we reworked the process and decision points to get that throughput and velocity back up to where it needed to be. And actually, we started to exceed where we were before it had started to go down. So this, obviously the impact here, we restored turnaround time to our adherence goals, and we're back within our compliance thresholds at a comfortable place. Reduced the overall peer-to-peer volume. As cases start to age, providers get anxious and they want to start talking to somebody. So we overall reduce that overall increases burden. We improve provider satisfaction. Again, providers and members are much happier when they get timely responses to their requests. And overall, this also rebalanced ROI, back to our previous issue, right? But if we're getting through more cases per day, we're reducing our administrative costs. That can only really help our overall ROI for the operation. So speed wasn't just an efficiency gain. It overall prevented provider abrasion, reduced network risk, and overall drove the value of our operation. Got one more example for you. So this is more of a clinical signal, and specifically we started to see a spike in appeals overturn rates. So similar signals, some variation in the signals in the data, but overturn rates specifically, they started to climb from 35 to 65%. So a pretty rapid increase in a relatively short period of time. When we dug in, we found that, you know, the overturns themselves were concentrated in a specific service line itself. So we sort of knew where to go look for where the issues were. And we also hadn't had any corresponding changes in medical policies or overall utilization trends, say new membership or new lines of business that would have otherwise caused this. So again, what we did here, so the action we took based on this signal, was to dig into which criteria were most frequently cited in the overturned cases. So not only which line of business are we looking in, but what subset of cases are really driving this uptick. We were able then to dig into which documentation standards were potentially unclear, whether the policy language had drifted based on updates to clinical guidelines, and whether reviewers were also applying those criteria inconsistently. So there were kind of a number of hypotheses to explore, but what we really found, was there was an issue with the clinical guidelines themselves. And a really important note here is that the answer to this problem is not to loosen the policy. It's actually to refine it and strengthen it, which may seem sort of maybe at odds, but the point of what we actually did here was to update the medical policy to align with current clinical evidence, but also be far more clear. So we clarified the documentation that was expected. We provided examples of how criteria was met. We conducted targeted reviewer calibration sessions. This is a really important piece to make sure that as we change clinical policy, that it's being applied consistently across our different reviewers. And we also adjusted the denial rationale language to align to any policy changes that had to be made, so that in our correspondence, we were really clear about where denials were tying back to which specific policy changes that had been made. So overall, the impact here was overturn rate dropped pretty dramatically. Again, we actually exceeded or got better than the point we were at before. Appeals volume overall decreased, which helped our admin costs overall. And also the peer-to-peer burden decreased. Again, where you have denials, you're going to want more peer-to-peer discussions from providers, which takes a lot of administrative time from our MD reviewers. So overall, the result wasn't just fewer appeals, it was a stronger defensibility and better alignment with the clinical evidence that exists today. So overall, 3 very different examples of ways that early indicators in your data can help you guide, so where to look, what to do about it, and ultimately get to faster resolution rather than being reactive in a much longer time frame.
Thank you, Lydia. Those examples are amazing. Using data and listening to signals to evaluate performance, make adjustments, and then feed those learnings back into the operation is critical. So we've talked a lot about insourcing and outsourcing and about the advantages of a hybrid model where work is often split between internal teams and external partners. How can a leader maintain oversight and pick up those signals when decisions, data, and workflows are happening across multiple streams and organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa. Obviously, this is easier if everything is in-sourced, right? It's your single source of data. It's all in one place, but that doesn't mean that vendors in a hybrid model aren't, we've talked about this before, that there's an appropriate use for vendors in this space. So I think the main point here is that in a hybrid model, oversight doesn't come from proximity, it comes from design. If visibility depends really on who sits down the hall from you, you've already lost control. So what good oversight comes from, it starts with one performance language, right? Internal teams and external partners have to operate off the same definitions, the same denial categories, the same turnaround clocks, same escalation triggers. Day to day, that means having unified dashboards. It means real-time or near real-time feeds, stratification by review type and service line, and also being able to drill down to the reviewer level. One problem we often see is that when we do get to a consolidated dashboard, operators and leaders aren't able to discern which data came from which sources. So we can't it's harder to pinpoint where issues are coming from. So moving along, standardized operating guardrails are also really important to just having that single source of truth. So in a high functioning hybrid model, partners don't just deliver volume, they operate within clearly defined guardrails. Everyone knows the performance bands that also trigger intervention, and we're all working off of the same standards on that front. This prevents drift and also, as we said previously, has a consistent view on where you're going to be able to find issues and attack them quickly. Governance cadence is the third pillar that really makes this work, right? It's that virtuous cycle in action. Oversight really only works when there are weekly operational reviews, monthly performance deep dives, quarterly policy calibration review, things like that. More frequent conversations so that we can look at the data that we have in a single source where we're working with the same guardrails, but ultimately we're coming together with our vendors to work together and understand how we're performing as one whole unit. The mistake that leaders make in treating vendor oversight is really treating vendor oversight as contract management. High-performing leaders treat this really as a shared clinical governance rather than just a contract management perspective. And really where leaders often lose visibility is in a lot of the gray space between those connections, right? It's all well and good to say, get all the data in one place and have it in a shared understanding. But leaders tend to lose visibility in the gray spaces between the systems when data, appeals data, and claims outcomes aren't really all integrated. So to make this more concrete for leaders today, leaders need to be able to see yesterday's volume, yesterday's TAT, and yesterday's denial rate. This can't be reactive to 2 months ago. They also need to be able to isolate the variation between reviewer and partner. We talked about that a minute ago, but it is really important to be able to differentiate performance, whether that between what's happening internally versus what's coming from a vendor, so that you know where to go problem solve. We need to review outlier cases weekly. We need to have the visibility to know where those outliers live, and then the governance to come together and work together to figure out why outliers are happening. We need the rapid feedback between criteria interpretation. Again, if you're going to use an outsourced vendor, you have to rely on those guardrails that you put in place up front to make sure that clinical decision making is consistent between your internal and your external teams. And ultimately, we've talked about this a number of times, the value of auditing, right? We have to be able to go back and audit the findings that also work in that virtuous cycle for training, right? Change management is a constant thing. As we're making changes to process or clinical policies, we need to make sure that everybody's got the same training, same understanding, so that we can apply all of those standards consistently. Really, to wrap it up, oversight isn't about catching errors months later. It's about detecting drifts within days. And the hybrid model doesn't reduce accountability. It increases the need for discipline. The more distributed that your model is, the more centralized your performance intelligence has to be.
So the leader is responsible for keeping that oversight tight every day, which raises a very practical question. What are the top 3 dashboards or metrics that leaders should be looking at daily to ensure they have their finger on the pulse of performance, risk, and opportunity?
Yeah, another great question. So if I'm a UM leader, I don't need 40 plus metrics. I really just need 3 dashboards that tell me whether the operation is flowing, whether decisions are defensible, and whether we're creating value. So the first is flow. This includes data points like volume, turnaround time, cases per review, or queue aging. This dashboard's going to tell me whether the engine is stable today and we're working the way we need to get through the work that's coming in. The second view is on fidelity. So this gets to denial rates, appeals, overturn rates, inter-rater reliability. Those are the data points you might expect to see on a dashboard like this. This is going to tell me whether our decisions are defensible and consistent. The last one is ROI, is impact. So this includes things like ROI per requirement, avoided spend, and variation patterns. This is going to tell me whether our operation is actually shaping utilization and creating value and functioning as a consumer protection as the utilization management function was originally designed to do. So if those three are stable and aligned, I know we're not just processing cases, we're managing risk intelligently. If one of those dashboards moves unexpectedly, I don't have to wait for month-end reporting. That's my signal to dig in immediately and start solutioning in one of those 3 areas or multiple.
UN leaders are stepping into transformation efforts right now, and they need to be able to show progress quickly without introducing new risk. Lydia, can you walk us through some concrete examples from your experiences in the field of what a transformation leader should focus on in the first 90 days to deliver meaningful quick wins?
It's another great question. So when a leader steps into a transformation effort, the first 90 days aren't really about redesigning the entire model. They're about creating that clarity, stabilizing performance, and proving that improvement is possible without increasing risk. So I like to think about it in sort of 3 phases. And in the first 30 days is diagnosing with precision. So in this case, leaders need a transparent baseline across accuracy, timeliness, and value, similar to the dashboards we've just talked about. So what that means is looking at audit scores, denial and overturn rates, turnaround times by product line, cases per reviewer, and ROI by any major PA requirements. The real insights in this phase come from looking at variance, and this is really important. Difference across market, product lines, reviewers, and vendor patterns. Transformation doesn't start with averages, it starts with outliers. Often just publishing a clean shared performance dashboard begins to improve behavior because it creates visibility and accountability, and it identifies those outliers that may be driving inefficiency across the board. So that's the first 30 days is sort of getting to just the visibility and able to diagnose where things are going on with that precision. So in the next period, kind of day 30 to 60, is removing friction without changing policy. So this is where teams usually see the fastest progress in turnaround and where they're able to make the most sort of immediate changes. So instead of rewriting medical policies, leaders should start to dissect their workflow. Are there too many cases being routed to MDs for review? Is documentation bouncing back unnecessarily? We've talked about the ping-ponging between systems that just causes, delays and back and forths. Are queues imbalanced, right? Is the way we've structured our workforce and the way we're assigning work out inappropriate, where you've got folks sitting around and you have folks who have too much work to get through in a single day. Can also look at routing logic. Is the system misaligned with risk and how we're using our auto approvals and all the way to full reviews and appeals? So fixing those issues can reduce turnaround time, decrease the peer-to-peer volume, lower appeals rates, and all without loosening any of your clinical standards. The quickest wins in rarely come from changing criteria. They come from tightening process. So moving into sort of the next period, 60 to 90 days is where you can start to make targeted data-driven recalibrations. So once the operation is stable and you understand where the signals are, you can begin controlled adjustments. That might mean shifting high-performing providers to Sentinel Review for a version of gold carding, increasing automation in low-variance services, removing codes altogether potentially from prior auth requirements, or updating criteria that are driving high overturn rates. Or even even sunsetting requirements where ROI is no longer justifying the administrative burden of the review itself. So these are all visible, measurable moves, and they can demonstrate maturity and not just cost cutting. By the end of 90 days in this frame, a strong leader should be able to point to 3 things. One area that is faster, one area that is more defensible, and one area that is driving clearer financial value.
Excellent, Lydia. Excellent. So those early wins are so important for building momentum and confidence across the organization. At the same time, those first 90 days could be where risk creeps in, especially if teams move too fast or focus on the wrong things. So what's the flip side of that? What are some of the most common pitfalls leaders should avoid in the first 90 days of a transformation effort? And how can they mitigate some of those risks?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The first 90 days of a transformation effort are where we can build momentum, but it's also where risk can quietly enter the system if leaders are moving too quickly or oversimplifying the problems they're facing. We see sort of three common pitfalls. So first is chasing speed at the expense of defensibility. There's often pressure to improve turnaround time immediately. But if teams start to loosen criteria interpretation, reduce documentation standards, or push too much into auto approval without proper risk stratification, you're going to end up, you may improve turnaround time, but you're going to end up increasing compliance exposure and inappropriate utilization, which could result in dramatic swings in cost. The mitigation here is simple, but disciplined. Separate your process fixes from your policy changes and validate any review type shifts with some retrospective data modeling before going live. That gives some indication, it's not going to be forward looking, but it will give some indication based on existing data of how levers you pull are going to actually impact total cost of care and can add some protection to changes that you might want to make. So the second pitfall that we see is underestimating operational interdependencies. Doesn't really operate in isolation. A routing change in the system can actually impact claims, payment integrity, appeals volumes, or even fraud detection. Leaders sometimes underestimate how connected these workflows are. Again, a simple mitigation here is that we need cross-functional alignment early on, involving your compliance teams, your payment integrity, your IT, provider relations teams before implementing any changes, not letting them know after issues surface and you've made changes. They need to be part of the solution, at least in an awareness capacity, so you don't end up just kicking problems down the road to a different team. So the third pitfall we see is overlooking the reviewer calibration and change management components. Teams often focus on dashboards and workflow redesign, and I've talked a lot about that already today, but they forget that clinical interpretation drives consistency. Without recalibration sessions and clear communication, variation starts to increase, and that shows up later as appeals and audit findings. The one thing that gets overlooked most often is interpretation drift. It doesn't show up immediately, but over time it erodes our defensibility in the decisions we're making. Ultimately, the discipline in the first 90 days is this: move fast on visibility and process stability, but move carefully on anything that's going to alter clinical decision-making thresholds. Speed builds momentum, but governance is what protects sustainability.
Lydia, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great discussion. Final question. There's one piece of advice you'd leave leaders with as they start their transformation journey, something to keep them grounded in those first 90 days, what would it be?
A great question. If I had to leave leaders with one piece of advice for the first 90 days of a transformation, it would be this: don't let financial pressures dictate reactive decisions. Transformation often is instigated because of administrative cost pressures coming from other parts of your organization. And the knee-jerk reaction is to look at headcount and ask, where can we reduce staff? But that's a pretty myopic view and can result in pretty significant impact outside of that lens. So if you cut capacity before you understand the variation, the workflow inefficiencies, and the policy calibration, you risk increasing appeals, provider and member abrasion, and compliance exposure, which ultimately drives more cost and not less. Instead, focus on clarity, understanding where the friction exists, where ROI is strong and weak, where review intensity is misaligned with risk. Fix process before cutting capacity. Sustainable transformation comes from smarter design and not smaller teams.
Lydia, you have been so helpful and so insightful today. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. We appreciate your insights from the front lines, and we hope to see you again soon.